Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I should introduce myself. I'm Chun Wei. I'm the research director for the Hinrich Foundation. But I do want to kick off, with a question for him. David Lynch, you know David Lynch.
He's a good
2
friend.
days ago, wrote for Washington Post quite a scathing critique of the Biden trade policy. And he feels that Biden looks a lot like Trump. And if you look at the state of global trade these days, if you look at the UNTAD reports, the ADB outlook was brought up with the LKY School of Public Policy roundtable that we heard earlier today. De-risking is in full swing, and David Lynch quotes Lawrence Summers in it, talking about Biden and saying of Biden's trade policy that it is increasingly dangerous. So, Keith, my first question to you is, how much do you agree on that?
Well, thank you very much, Chun Wei, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, David is a good friend. He's actually working on a book right now about globalization and how we got to where we are. And I would say that the world has become ever more complicated. And if you think back 8 decades ago to the creation of the multilateral system and the international organizations that have underpinned it during that period of time, you'll recall that architecture was born of crisis, actually 3 crises, 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And it actually took the 3rd crisis for people to get their act together. Because the way that they responded after the first 2 crises was to turn inward and to adopt policies that were self-centered. And you will argue that that's what a government should do. Look after itself, its government, its people first. And I would argue that what came afterwards, the creation of this international architecture, what became the WTO was first the GATT, but also the Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations,
IMF,
IMF and the World Bank, was something bigger than any one country. It was about multilateralism. And at the time, this was quite a novel notion, but it was clear that the direction people were going was leading to catastrophe. It doesn't get much worse than 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And so they decided to do things differently. Well, now we are facing a period of crisis as well, crises, polycrises, as some people refer to it. And I'm afraid that the reaction that we're seeing is, in some respects, reminiscent of what happened in the 20s and the 30s.
This is a subject of a paper that you're working on right now.
Yes, it is. And so when you look, if you were to analyze what the Biden administration is doing, and it's true on one level, the tariffs on Chinese goods have been retained. Some of the tariffs on steel and aluminum have been retained. But his approach is not the same. He's an internationalist who is terrified that Donald Trump will be reelected. But he has adopted in many respects a more international policy with respect, for example, to climate change, corporate taxation. But at the end of the day, many of these giant pieces of legislation that have been enacted under his presidency are extremely self-centered, because the Democratic Party has come to the conclusion that Trump struck a nerve on trade. Remember that some of these people in the Democratic Party were at the barricades in Seattle, and now they're in the corridors of the State Department and the White House. And their fundamental...
And Silicon Valley.
Yeah. And their fundamental attitude towards trade has not really changed. And then there's the fact that China has become so powerful and so big that it's, in the US, I believe this to be an overstated concern to a certain extent. We can talk about that more, but it's the bipartisan view that China is a threat. So if you combine these two things, this suspicion of trade and this concern about China, and you put underneath this the fear of Donald Trump getting the people who had supported him in 2016 back on board, then you can begin to see a little bit about where they're coming from. And as I say, Biden is not an isolationist. He chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's vice president for 8 years.
Right.
He knows. And his views expressed now as president are not really in line with what he has said before.
Yeah.
But for the reasons I mentioned, he's been driven into this position, and he is addressing some serious fundamental shortcomings in the United States. The infrastructure is dilapidated. The fact that the country depends on very few other countries to produce the high-end semiconductors, really just Taiwan.
Yeah.
You can see where some of these concerns arise, the inequality in the country. But a lot of these things are best addressed through other tools than trade. And okay, he's trying to do that too. But what concerns me is that trade gets dragged into the equation of inequality domestically. You can't make that argument globally because trade has raised people's living standards globally to an extent that would have been unbelievable to the architects of the international system back in 1945.
Yeah. Well, I've got a bunch of follow-up questions.
Sure.
Obviously, as always on that. Before that, though, I should say thank you as well to the many people who've tuned in online for this open house, and to thank all of you who've shown up on a working weekday. It's really great to see everyone here. If there are any questions, if anyone wants to jump in with the discussions, let's just jump in. You can interrupt us at any time. We don't really, it doesn't really matter. But what I do want to, come back to, Keith, is that, one of the things that we are seeing, and we're a bit perhaps confused by, is that there are these dueling data out there on how toxic really is trade as an electoral issue. I think David sort of mentions in his article for Wash Post, that it remains like highly toxic.
Yeah.
Bill Reinsch at CSIS says that, well, maybe not so. He's sort of citing, a different set of data. But so clearly there's this, at least a tug of war in trying to reshape the narrative of what trade means. And one thing that I think with the election year coming up is that increasingly, despite having to cater to those bases that you're talking about, the U.S. also has to understand that it increasingly relies on a network of international alliances to defend the extraterritorial powers that it's trying to project in many aspects of AI and tech and trade and so on. It needs those allies. And in Asia in particular, that alliance has always been built on big economic strategy.
Yeah.
A big part of which is trade.
Yep.
So how does he square that circle? I mean, and what does the data tell us, really?
Well, it's tricky, particularly here, because you've got a country like Singapore, which is close to the US and China. And there's a lot of good things about that. Sometimes you can feel a little bit, you're not just, I think it was Pierre Trudeau who said he said, living next to the United States is like being in bed with an elephant. And if the elephant rolls over, it's very bad news for you. And to a certain extent, Singapore has got 2 elephants.
Yeah.
So you have to be very skillful in the way in which you interact with these two important countries, important for Singapore. But what you say is true. And in the case of the Biden administration, what they seem to have done, Donald Trump pulled the plug on the TPP. Mr. Trudeau's son now has called it, and everyone has accepted this, as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Donald Trump pulled out after 3 days, despite lots of evidence suggesting that this would be good for the country in terms of its economic prosperity. And if there is this notion of engaging with this part of the world, particularly when China is nearby and is welcoming, pulling everybody in, this was a very good way to do that. But the political calculation in Washington at this point has been that this is not something to enter into because it's not where votes will be. And you mentioned David's article and the conflicting data with what Bill Reinsch has said. Yeah. And it all depends on how you ask the question. And I can remember lots of polling from the Council on Foreign Relations and Pew and whatnot. And sometimes you'd get people who would respond and say, trade is good for me, but it's not good for the country. Or trade is good for other countries, but not for the US. And I think the problem with that is that the data just doesn't suggest this. To suggest that somehow the income inequality in the US is attributed to trade, it just doesn't make sense. The United States is not a trade-dependent country. Only about a quarter, the trade equals only about a quarter of its GDP, which compared to Singapore or Switzerland or Ireland is nothing. And yet the Gini coefficient that reflects income inequality is terrible. Not as terrible as South Africa, which has the worst in the world, and it's not very trade dependent either. Or Brazil, which again, these turn out to be big countries by and large. And so if trade really was the problem, well, why is Singapore doing so well? Why is Switzerland, why is Ireland doing well? They're much more trade dependent, the Netherlands. So I don't understand exactly, I mean, I do understand where it comes from. It comes from the fact that it's just much easier to point the finger at trade and say these jobs have disappeared because of this, rather than say technology is a really critical reason why factory jobs are gone. Not just factory jobs, a lot of services jobs. Travel agents, bank tellers, the Port of Singapore, the people who used to work there are replaced by automatic trucks and cranes. So, and that's, do we say that that's a bad thing? No one wants to say that technology is a bad thing because everybody loves their phone. So you're not going to say that. And the result is, if you want to look at the reasons for income inequality, you have to look at much more complicated things, even than trade. You have to look at educational opportunity, housing opportunity. You have to look at racism, which is a terrible stain on the country to this day. You have to look at things which are not easy to solve. But if you could just simply say, well, it's thanks to trade. The steel industry has had difficulty thanks to trade. Well, I'm afraid it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's often a case that trade is sort of put us a bogeyman. But a lot of the factors that you mentioned, Gini coefficient, racism, issues of societal values, and so on, are actually part of a range of indicators that we look at in the Sustainable Trade Index that the foundation puts out every year, where we look at 70 indicators spread almost equally in 3/3 on environmental, societal, and economic indicators. And we look at things like ecological footprint and Gini coefficient and income inequality, because we think that all of those things matter to trade. And this is it's a great example of how trade policy as an electoral narrative gets reshaped because you don't get those factors right in the first place. But sort of pivoting back to the sort of main theme of today's open house, which is the age of trade fragmentation. Yes, it is. IPEF is one of these attempts for the Biden administration to perhaps find a new way forward. Do you buy it?
Look, when you reach out to other countries and you sit down with them, it's a good thing. If you sit down with countries and you try to persuade them to adopt your agenda, that can be a good thing. But if you sit down with countries and try to persuade them to adopt your agenda and you offer them absolutely nothing in return, that's just really pie in the sky. And I'm afraid that that's what IPEF is. I mean, IPEF is, I'm trying to recall, it's a trade pillar, it's a supply chain pillar. Why those two aren't the same pillar, I don't really understand. I mean, what are the supply chains for? And then it's fair trade, and the fourth one is sustainable trade. Anyone know what the fourth one is?
Yeah.
And I'm
Digital pillar and a tax and kind of corruption pillar.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But is
that's
that the
corruption
fair
pillar.
trade one?
Yeah.
Anyway, all of these things. So you sit there and you say,
Thanks,
well, to a certain extent, they're all trade, and yet none of it is trade, because there's no market access being discussed. And the United States has tried to persuade countries in this part of the world and elsewhere to adopt standards on labor rights and environmental protection. And in the WTO, they tried this, and in exchange, they were promising access to this vast market. Well, now they're asking for these things without that prospect at all. And just to illustrate the futility of this, consider that they tried to persuade the Japanese just a week or two ago. Well, let's include a ban on whaling as part of the trade pillar in exchange for nothing.
Yeah.
Now, whatever your views on whaling, the Japanese have a very strong view, and everyone knows what it is. And if you're going to persuade them to give up something like this and offer them nothing, well, I would say that your prospects for success are not very realistic. India isn't even participating in the trade pillar. Now, Malaysia and Indonesia have traditionally had real objections to including labor standards in trade agreements. They haven't come out explicitly now to say that they are against this, but if the Americans are going to seek something ambitious while giving up nothing, well, what are they expecting? Now, the line from the administration is, well, this will encourage private sector investment in your country. Really? How can they be sure of that? And, oh, by the way, we've just put in place some restrictions on outbound investment to China, covering tech. So it just, I mean, I don't think the idea prima facie is necessarily a terrible idea. And setting up some kind of a consultant group to talk about supply chains and where you have problems and
That is increasingly what it sounds like, isn't it?
Well, that's what it is.
It's a consulting group.
it's a talk shop,
Yeah.
which in and of itself isn't bad, but it's not going to generate too much by way of
Momentum.
economic growth or headlines. And the reason they're shying away from this is because of the reason they don't mention trade in the economic blueprint. They're afraid, and even with what they've been discussing, which again is pretty much consultative, there's still a backlash. And the business community has been very unhappy with this.
Yeah.
And they think it's a missed opportunity. They see that the United Kingdom has joined the CPTPP. China wants to get in. They're knocking on the door. And where is the U.S.? And this is what their argument is. It's very, and it's very forcefully stated. They also think that what's happening with respect to e-commerce, digital trade, whatever, neither of those concepts is precisely defined, by the way, and sometimes they're interchangeable. What they see happening there, they actually think is taking steps backward. So who exactly is supporting this? If the business community, who has traditionally been the one constituency in support of trade, if they're not enthusiastic about this,
Yeah.
and to be frank, when you talk to people from this region about it, it's sort of, well, the US wants us to do this, so we will. But the Japanese example, if you're asking us to pay to join your club, then sorry, not interested.
Yeah, yeah. It sort of reminds me of something that you said earlier about the business community and how they're not meeting Thai very much. And we're talking here about Catherine Tai, and it's a point that I want to pursue with you. But it also sort of brings to mind something that I read that about there's always been a disconnect between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. It's an expertise gap, it's a cultural gap, it's a generational gap. There's a place that's just built on growth and constant change of young disruptors, and they don't really get
Move fast and break things.
And they don't really get a bunch of older people who've stayed in the system and grow within the system, and they don't really see the benefits of working in a position where you have to look 50 years down the road and think of issues that are larger than your immediate growth prospects. But somewhere in between, they need to find a way. I mean, the guy who wrote about this, Jacob Hellberg, he's an ex-Googler. He describes it as the valley and the hill. This great disconnect. But it comes back in a way to the point that you're making, but in a different way, because you said earlier that the business community, in a separate discussion, that the business community isn't really talking to Catherine Tai that much. And at the same time, I think you said that Tai was meeting a lot with the unions. And in Detroit, all she took was meetings with the UAW and so on. So between Catherine Tai and Jake Sullivan and Gina Raimondo, clearly there are sort of variations. And Keith, by the way, has one of the reasons why he's our research fellow is because he has a deep and wide Rolodex, and he knows a lot of people in Brussels, in Washington D.C., Geneva. That's one of the reasons why he's such a great resource. But in your read of these characters, these leaders, what's going on? Who's talking to whom, and what's that doing to trade policy?
Well, one of the things that is clear is that the Department of Commerce has a much bigger role to play than had been the case for some time. On the question of export controls, and we're seeing a lot of export control going on now, not just in the US, by the way, but everywhere. China has just put in place these export controls on rare earths. These countries from Indonesia to Zimbabwe are trying to restrict the export of raw materials to force investors and extractors to put processing and production facilities on the ground domestically, and it's working well in Indonesia. But the other thing is that Secretary Raimundo is the Department of Commerce is a cheerleader for business. She's also a former governor. She understands how elections are won. She understands why it is that on things like outward investment restrictions, you have to be very careful because it's a little bit of a domino effect. She understands that a lot of important US pension funds have invested in Chinese companies, including educators in big states like California and Texas. And if you go about this with a bludgeon instead of a scalpel, you could unwind someone's retirement portfolio in an election year.
Having said that, I mean, the flip side of that argument is that, at some point you do have to learn how to build that fence.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I like the Sullivan line, a small yard and a high fence.
Yeah. That's what I mean.
Well, yeah, look, I'm not, but like that's what I say. If you use a scalpel, there may be circumstances in which these kinds of controls are warranted. But you've got to take care. And I think Secretary Raimundo understands that. She's in China right now, and she's saying things which, and I think this is another example of Biden. He has said some tough things about China, but he's also sent 4 cabinet secretaries to Beijing in the last 4 months. So whether he can continue to walk that very fine line, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
But it does indicate that the guy is pretty savvy in terms of seeing the big picture. China is politically toxic in the U.S. right now. And as I said at the beginning, I think a lot of this is perhaps overblown, but China doesn't always help itself.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you said, about export controls and you were listing these examples, and I was thinking that you might have missed out China.
Well, no, because China has already lost 2 cases in the WTO.
Yeah, I mean, there's a history of export controls.
They do, and they're back at the well
long
again.
Precedes
Yeah,
what's happening today.
gallium and germanium again. I think this is something which is very unfortunate. I mean, export controls, if you really want to talk about something that's protectionist, export controls are, in my view, more protectionist than import controls, and more potentially damaging, because if you restrict the export of food and medicine, as we've seen on a wide scale in the last 2 or 3 years, you're putting people's lives at risk. You're not talking about, putting some extra tariffs on textiles or laptops or whatever. You're talking about life and death.
That's the weaponization part of it. Yeah.
That's the weaponization.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in on it?
Of course.
Sure.
Yeah.
So China has been, thank you. So China's recent action has been very skillful, I would say, because what China did on the 2 critical minerals is not to impose a quota on the exports, but just put the 2 minerals under the licensing system because in the previous cases, the grounds for China for the the winning parties is really China has the raw materials and rare earths under licensing system and separately puts quota on how much you can export.
Right.
So this time, China had the first system, like put them under licensing requirements without actually explicitly, at least, imposing a restriction on exports. So you don't really have the evidence at the moment to say that these minerals are actually subject to restriction. So that's kind of the difference at the moment China is doing. So my view on this is kind of very symbolic, because China wants to demonstrate its will and ability to kind of escalate the defensive strategy, I would say.
Which is the same as solar, right? They have.
Yeah.
You're saying that.
But without kind of trying to impose a major immediate economic impact yet.
But an export license is a restriction.
It is.
And the U.S. has put in place a system of licensing as well with respect to advanced technologies. And they did this, by the way, with the COVID vaccines. With respect to the advanced technology, they said you can apply for a license, don't expect to get it.
Presumption of denial. Yeah.
Presumption of denial. Now, are the Chinese doing that too? We have to wait and see. But just by simply putting this in place, it's going to push down the likelihood that these things will be exported. And who knows? Like you say, it's a pressure point. And I think you're absolutely right. It is in response to U.S. actions, which may have been in response to previous Chinese actions, which may have been. I mean, this is a tit for tat set of circumstances that's at play here, and the danger is that it escalates to the point where it spirals out of control. And for the moment, and that's why I think having I understand that Minister Wong and Secretary Raimundo have established a consultative group to talk about these things.
Which Minister Wong?
The MOFCOM minister.
Oh, right. Got it.
He,
Yeah.
he, I mean, we've been making fun of people having a talk shop, but to have some kind of lines of communication in place, particularly if you've been through the sort of stressful period that the bilateral relationship has been through in the last year or so, before that even, well, this is a good thing. I mean, that's reestablishing connection. That's grounds for optimism, I think. But let's wait and see. You know, I mean, we had a spy balloon drift over the U.S., and that meant Blinken's trip was off the boards. So anything can happen, and when sensitivities are as high as they are now, even the smallest thing become. I mean, I have no idea how many spy balloons are flying over where, but if this is the timing of this was terrible. So when that kind of thing happens, if people are already on edge, it doesn't take much to push them over. So the fact that there's been an effort to try and smooth things over can only be good in my view.
That's a great question, Wei Huan. Thank you.
It's true.
We have a question from the floor.
Okay.
And it sort of pivots back to the WTO.
Okay.
And it says, given the absence of the US in CPTPP, why don't they at least play a more constructive role at the WTO? Is the USTR not more committed to multilateral initiatives in Geneva?
Well, that's really a question you should put to them. But what I would say is, before, the US used to take the bull by the horns and just lead the process. You see a lot less of that now, for the reasons that we've just mentioned. If you are the leader on trade, you're going to be a target, particularly in the minds of the people in the Biden administration domestically with their constituents like the trade unions. If they, on the other hand, just sit to the side and do nothing, then they run the risk of having the agenda shaped by others. So they're trying, like with IPEF, they're trying to somehow maneuver in such a way that they can keep a hand in without leaving fingerprints in any meaningful way. So they've been active on things like fishery subsidies. They've been active on things like the domestic regulation and services. I mean, the WTO is doing badly, but maybe not as badly as you think it's doing. We had this agreement on domestic regulation and services just last month, a really important and kind of, to a certain extent, mind-boggling agreement on investment, investment facilitation. Now, investment was one of those issues we used to call the Singapore issues. Because at the Singapore Ministerial, which was our first ministerial back in '96, there were 4 issues that were the US, the EU, and others were pushing: investment, competition, transparency in government procurement, and trade facilitation. Only trade facilitation saw the light of day, and investment was such a hot button issue that it was consigned really to the sidelines. And yet, the way they have reformulated this, it's a sort of a transparency thing designed to help developing countries attract foreign investment. It doesn't have market access commitments. It doesn't offer investor protections. It simply says, you will inform people of what your investment regime is. You have to go on the website and you have to put this in there. There has to be a place that people can go to get information, to file a complaint. Very much like the trade facilitation agreement.
Yeah.
And you know, the calculations are always something of a hit or miss thing, but they're saying between a half a percentage point and 1 3/4 percentage point of GDP can be added to countries that are parties to this agreement. U.S. did not participate in that. China was really a driving force. China, Korea, Chile were the big driving forces on this. Where the U.S. engagement is going to be absolutely critical is on the reform of the dispute settlement system. Because I don't know if people are aware of this, but it doesn't really function anymore. Because the US has essentially rendered dysfunctional the appellate body. Now what that means is when you file a case, you go to a panel, and the panel will issue a ruling which can be appealed. Every party to a dispute has the right to appeal. Absent that right, if you lose the case and appeal, you are casting that case into a legal void. So, for example, Indonesia has lost its case on its restrictions on exports of nickel ore. The EU brought a case, and the panel ruled in December against the Indonesians, and the Indonesians said, well, we appeal. And now that case is in limbo for a very long time until we can reform the WTO dispute settlement system. Now, the American interest in doing this, they pledged at the last ministerial back in June of last year, that they would, the ministers pledged that the members would reform the WTO's dispute settlement system by next year. And in the minds of negotiators, that was taken to mean by the ministerial conference, which will be in late February of next year. Well, there's a few problems with that. The first is that February 2024 is just a few months away from the next US presidential election. The other problem is that the things that the Americans have raised about the appellate body, many of their complaints have merit. And the wider membership has come to agree with this. It was not a group that was following its mandate.
I remember you talking about this in your very first paper.
Yeah.
And sort of addressing the need for this reform of the DSM.
I mean, overreach is a danger. And if they are creating new rights and obligations that have not been negotiated, well, that's a dangerous thing to do. And that's the view now. They created jurisprudence, which they were not supposed to do, and on and on. The other thing that has made this more problematic is that the United States and others, but particularly the United States, has invoked national security as a reason for implementing trade restrictions. Donald Trump did this with respect to the steel and aluminum tariffs that he applied back in 2018, I think. And when you do that, it's kind of, there had been a unwritten rule that you were not going to invoke this. Because if you did, you created this terrible catch-22. Because if you read Article 21, which is the national security exemption, to say that countries have the absolute right to declare what is in their national security interest, then that means that anyone who wants can invoke this, and you can basically steer an aircraft carrier through that legal loophole. On the other hand, if you believe that it's left to a panel to determine what is in the national security interests of Russia or China or the United States, I mean, 3 trade geeks sitting on the shores of Lake Geneva are going to tell a hugely powerful country what's in their national security? That doesn't look very good either.
And particularly when Russia invoked national security.
They did. They did. And they, on that particular case, because they were at war with Ukraine, their case held up. But they said, I think the word is unjudiciable, which means you can't bring it here. And the US and Russia argued this, and the panel said, no.
Right.
You can bring the case here. And so until they can figure out what to do with this, and the United States, this is not new. The United States has said from the very beginning, no one else can say what the US can declare in terms of national security. And I can see their point. But on the other hand, there is this legal loophole. And that's why for so many years, no one ever messed around with this. And all of a sudden, we've got Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE and Ukraine and Russia. You've got the US and Hong Kong.
Yeah, the rules are pretty much gone.
Well,
I mean,
I mean, the U.S. said that they wanted to label products from Hong Kong as made in China,
Yeah.
and they said it was for national security.
Yeah.
Well,
But this is a good point because we're talking about trade fragmentation to talk about China in the context of the WTO maybe, but and it's a huge question. We've barely touched it, and I've already eaten up almost all of the time. Is there anyone else that has a question? Because otherwise, I could just keep going with Keith because I usually do. There you go. I'm sorry about chewing up so much time. But,
sorry,
please.
that's me taking up time.
So I'm mindful of time, I'll keep it short.
Yeah.
I've picked up two themes from your conversation, right? Fear of China and the domestic inequality in the United States. So I acknowledge those 2 points, but I'm also wondering whether there has been a fundamental shift in thinking towards China in the US. I mean, what we are seeing right now is the manifestation of, actions, right, targeted at China, but they don't happen overnight.
No.
So this must have been brewing for some time. And I'm going back to the 1970s when the United States formally recognized China, right?
Yep.
And the PRC became the official government, and the ROC, is now in a bit of a quagmire or a state of uncertainty, right?
Right.
And perhaps the entry of China into the world economic institutions was premised on a certain set of beliefs which have not materialized today. And perhaps what we are witnessing is, a sort of scaling back, maybe withdrawing things that have been extended to China on those beliefs, right? And in fact, I have overheard, or rather I've heard in some context about, the move towards stripping China of the preferred nation status. I'm not familiar with trade law, so I really don't know what's the implication of that. But I would like your thoughts on whether we are actually witnessing something that's more fundamental than just, appeasing the local electorate. Thank you.
Well, the answer to your question is yes. And the preferred national trade treatment is MFN under the WTO. Before the U.S. could agree on the terms of China's accession, they had to first get Congress to lift this discriminatory treatment. They had to do the same thing with Russia, by the way. And I think, and I can remember this, in 2001, in Doha, at the ministerial conference, when China's and Taiwan's accessions were approved on consecutive days, nobody was saying this was a troublesome or bad thing. No one. It's equally true that I don't think there was a single person, including the Chinese minister, Shi, who thought that China would be the tremendous economic powerhouse that they became. I don't think anyone envisaged that. And I can remember talking to Mr. Long, and he was very worried about exposing China's nascent industries to the ferocious competition that would come from Japanese, American, European companies. And when I spoke to him 10 years after that, he said, well, if you want to be the best, you got to play with the best. And I didn't know that at first. I just kept thinking our poor companies are going to be steamrolled. And they responded. I mean, all credit to China. But there was this feeling somehow that if China entered into this system, they would become more like a Western country, to your point. They would be more open, they would be more democratic. That might have been a naive view to hold at that time, but that was a view that was, not uncommon. And China's has changed too, huh? They've changed as well. They've become more inward-looking, more nationalistic. Inward-looking is maybe not the right term because they've also been outward-looking with things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
But they do have a two markets view of the world.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And if you listen to US businesses or European businesses, they're highly critical of some of the restrictions that have been in place. And if you look at the severe fall off in inward foreign investment in China this year, it reflects the fact that people think doing business there is really difficult to do now. And if you hold up a not wanted sign, you're going to have people going somewhere else. So, I hesitate to put the blame on any one player here. I think people kind of lost the plot. China has succeeded by coming into the trading system, and before that, for the decades of openness that they've been part of, in lifting 800 million people, is that the figure? I don't know exactly, but something like this, out of poverty, something which is astounding, and for which they are to be congratulated. But they have also engaged in actions that have caused a great deal of concern and have warranted some prudence on the part of their partners. And that's why it's very important that they find a way forward on this, because, hey, China's not going anywhere. They've been around for 5,000 years, and they are the biggest country in the world, and they are very successful, and you have to find a way to live and work with them. That's just the reality. So things came out in a way that people did not expect, including, I would be very surprised if anyone in China would have imagined that 20 years after they joined the WTO, they'd be the second biggest economy and the biggest trading nation on earth. And that's where they are. And like I say, I mean, people should give them credit for that, because it is an extraordinary thing to do. But I remember once in a seminar in Africa, and I was on the panel representing the WTO, but my accent gave me away, and there was a lady from our host government there who was highly critical of my country, and one of the journalists there asked me, "What do I think about this?" And my response was, in my experience, big countries make other countries nervous. And when it comes to countries, they don't come bigger than China. And the Chinese know this, huh? When you're big, you have to be a little bit sensitive and careful about what you do, because it has ramifications that go global. It's a long way of answering your question. Did I answer your question?
Well, not fully for me, because I think that's one aspect.
All right,
of
hold
it
my
that-
feet to the fire.
I think that's one aspect of it that you didn't quite mention, which is that the sheer the peculiarity of having a state that is so closely enmeshed with the party. And
Oh, well,
it's,
that's true.
But in any case, sorry, that's
That's
true. Kind
true.
of question.
That's true. We don't have too many
And-
cases where the party has this kind of economic control.
No, it's
That's
and
true.
It's the pace of growth of this particular economy to such a volume, I think, also imposes certain strains, on the system.
I think that's true.
I have a question from Brett Williams, who's asking, somewhat related. Do you think that China and the US need to reach some kind of agreement on which methods of determining normal values? That just disappeared. Normal values in bracket in anti-dumping law. Brett's probably an attorney. And
Yeah, I think so.
In NME, talking about NME methods, as a prerequisite to being able to negotiate more liberalization of market access.
Well, this was a huge issue at the time of China's accession. And there was a transition period whereby during the transition period, governments bringing anti-dumping cases against China could use a proxy for determining the fair market value, because the thinking was, well, China's not a market economy, so looking at the value of whatever the product is in Shanghai or Shenzhen or wherever is not a fair reflection of the value of the product. Instead, they should use another country. And the Chinese hated this. And it was another one of those examples of rules. In this case, ambiguity did not favor the Chinese. And this is not something that's widely known, but the panel, the way the panel makes a decision is they have they put out what do they call it again? I'm losing my memory here. It's a preliminary report before the final report. An interim report, there you go, thank you, on which the parties can comment. And the story goes that the interim report, China lost everything.
Ah, yes, I remember, yeah.
They lost on every point. It was against the EU, I think. And rather than have this report become public, the Chinese just withdrew it. They just withdrew it. Now, that's never been publicly acknowledged, but that's the scuttlebutt.
Yeah.
Now that I'm a private citizen, I can say that's what the rumor mill says. And if you look at the way this thing came out, well, it makes sense. So we haven't heard much about this since then. Of course, anti-dumping duties are kind of redundant when you're slapping $550 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods anyway. So, and in fact, on things like steel, hardly any steel was even getting into the U.S. market because there were so many anti-dumping and countervailing duties piled onto Chinese steel. But you don't hear about it much anymore. And it's one of those things where this is why when they try to repair the dispute settlement system, you have to take into account a different reality. There's the national security, there's all this environmental stuff. People can say environmental measures are national security now, and who's to say they're not right? If you look at some of the catastrophes we've seen just this last summer, whether it's CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in Europe, or the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, even if a panel were to rule against those two powers on this, they're not going to listen to a panel on something like this.
Yeah.
They're just going to do it anyway. And that just, that undermines the authority and the legitimacy of a dispute settlement system if you can't take into account this broader picture. So I don't know what they're going to do, but I'd be very surprised if the dispute settlement system were reformed next year.
Great. Does anyone else want to jump in at this point? Right.
Yeah, I have a question about the. Thank you. I have a question about the crisis in Ukraine. From a business perspective, I am under the impression that USA is benefiting the more from the situation, from an energy point of view, food supply point of view. And I'm just wondering, this is a good way for them to get Europe even weaker from a business perspective. And I'm just wondering who has any benefit in seeing the end of this crisis.
Vous êtes française?
Oui.
Nous pouvons discuter après. I'm not sure anyone's benefiting from this crisis in the Ukraine. Possibly arms merchants are benefiting. Energy,
Chinese oil importers.
maybe Indian oil importers. Yeah, that's a good point. Europe has now basically established a system of non-dependency on Russian oil. I think it's accelerated a lot of the renewable energy projects in Europe. I think on the question of grains, food, well, the EU is having a record harvest, which given the heat of this last summer is kind of hard to imagine, but that's what the FAO says. I don't know. I don't know if Europe, whether the US has made a specific plan. That would strike me as pretty Machiavellian. I think, from what I understand, the US is spending about $50 billion a year in terms of support for Ukraine, and it's not politically a consensus view, as you would have seen if you heard the Republicans talking last week. So I don't think that's the case. I could be wrong, and Chuan Wei makes a good point. The Russians have had to discount their exports of energy products because the European market, perhaps the most lucrative in the world, is no longer available to them. And that's not good for them. And Europe has, in a very short period of time, found a way to replace that energy. It was fortunate that the winter last year wasn't quite as bad as people had thought it might be. But still, I mean, if you look at the Germans and you look at those Nord Stream projects that they had in place, people thought they were completely held to ransom, and they weren't. So, I mean, that was kind of an impressive success story people don't talk about too much. But as far as the basis of your question, I don't know. Maybe you can tell me what you know that makes you think that, and we can discuss that more. Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on it, like, yourself, or?
Yes, because I have seen a kind of polarization and weaponization on the economy between the big economies in Europe and the US, and the US bringing everything on the compliance and legal topics as a weapon for, fighting big European companies. So, and I'm wondering, to me, it's a bit the same logic to make, to continue to make Europe weaker and big European companies weaker in order to push more the USA. If you see the situation on ammunition in Europe, situation on energy, this is critical. And they have seen increase of price of energy in Europe that we have not seen here in Asia Pacific.
Yeah.
Not to that level, at least.
Yeah, and the price of energy is 3 to 5 times higher in Europe than in the US.
Yes.
But that's a reflection also of natural resources and the fact that US has got this fracking industry, the shale oil. I really don't know the answer to your question, whether or not there has been something going on. I know that within Europe, there are various views about how hard of a line to hold. And if you talk to people from Poland or from the Baltics, they think the line is not hard enough. There should be a harder line. The fact that you have Finland and Sweden joining NATO is really quite extraordinary when you think about it. So I don't think the US is in their interest to see Europe weak. I don't think that's something that they would want. There may be something there that I'm unaware of, but as far as I know, I don't see why that would be something the US would want.
I mean, there was a line in one of your papers, quoting a Brussels diplomat, where you said that the Brussels diplomat was saying that the US is always going to be our ally, but it isn't always our friend.
Yes.
But I think that's a distinction from what
Yes.
what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, there's competition.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
But especially at this time.
Yeah. I mean, competition is a little different. Yeah, from sort of deliberately weakening it in the strategic way that.
I mean, President Macron. That was the first state dinner that Biden had, was for President Macron in December, and Macron just hammered him on this Inflation Reduction Act, saying, what are you doing? Why our companies can't benefit from this? And I saw a story that I think I mentioned in one of the other meetings we had, where Chad Bound from the Peterson Institute in Washington has done this study that shows that even though Europe and Korea do not have these mineral access kind of quasi-trade agreements, imports of EU and Korean electric vehicles have just gone through the roof in the US. So somehow, even though, and according to Chad, what he says is the way the Treasury has written these rules enables them to get their cars to the market. And they've probably written the rules in such a way that the Congress is not yet aware of this because, or perhaps the trade unions. But it does show you that when Monsieur Macron comes to the White House, the president listens to what he has to say.
That actually brings us to another question from our online audience tuning in. Again, bringing up U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the one that you refuse to refer to as IRA,
Yeah.
because of your Irish origins, and asks, can you tell us more about the subsidy regimes adopted by major countries in green industries, and how do you see it affecting global trade? It's a pretty sort of broad question. Do you just
Well, the U.S. is not the only country. Europe has done this as well, and so have the Japanese. And investing in green technology is a huge business everywhere. I haven't done the research into Singapore, but I'd be very surprised if Singapore isn't in doing the same thing. It's a huge problem. I know in Africa they're doing this. Solar energy is a big deal, and in the Middle East, well, why not? You have access. I mean, the sun is a resource that should be tapped, but it requires technological advance, and it requires using these critical raw materials to do this, and they're scarce, and scarcity means expensive.
Right.
So I think these subsidies, and this gets back to what I was saying earlier about the dispute settlement system being reformed. If there were to be a case in which a government's subsidizing green energy projects was deemed to not be in compliance with WTO rules, there'd be a huge outcry. And in the past, the way the system had worked, environmental issues were actually handled with surprising sensitivity, whether it had to do with shrimpers catching turtles in their nets, or the question of the use of asbestos, or whatever it may be.
When you say sensitivity, what kind of sensitivity?
Well, there was an understanding that there was something bigger than trade at play here. That asbestos is dangerous stuff. But in Canada, they had a town in Quebec that was actually called asbestos, even though that's not the French word. Qu'est-ce que c'est le mot en français pour le asbestos? It's for asbestos. There's another word in French, but in Quebec, that's the word that they used.
Really?
And it was in fact the French who brought the case against the Canadians, and because the French weren't going to import this stuff because it's dangerous. And the panel actually acknowledge this. There have been cases documented where environmental protection trumps trade. Whether on a scale of the Inflation Reduction Act or the European Green Program, whether someone would accept that, because in fact there are discriminatory elements to this. It looks as though the Biden administration is trying to do this for its friends, but China's not benefiting from this. And that's something that the Chinese might not like. In fact, I'm sure they don't like it. So would that be something that they would want to take? I'm not sure if the question pertains to the compliance of these subsidies with WTO rules.
I think it's more an entry-level sort of thing. But your answer sort of speaks to some of the. Your answer actually sort of, in a way, segues into this next question that we have online. But before we go there, I mean, is there anybody else here who wants to ask something? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I'm quite interested about the emerging technologies' influence in the global trading. So because I believe that the rapid technological advancements have implications for the trade and economics. So I would like to ask Mr. Keith, in your opinion, so what role might emerging technologies and the digital trade play in either, making better or make worse, in the issue of trade fragmentation?
I think that's one of the critical questions of our day. I mean, I firmly take the view, as I think I've said earlier, that a lot of jobs that we've had in place for a long time, decades, if not centuries, are disappearing. And yes, trade is a reason for this, but it's not the principal reason. I think the principal reason for this is technology. And I think that and the Port of Singapore would be an example. If you were a dock worker in the Port of Singapore, you're not a worker there anymore. And that's very hard. But that's the reality. Now, when you talk about artificial intelligence, there's every likelihood, and I'm not a tech expert, but the evidence that I've been able to decipher indicates that the impact of artificial intelligence on jobs will extend far beyond manual labor, far beyond robots or driverless trucks. It could go down to all kinds of things, medical analysis, even journalists, heaven forbid.
It's already happening.
It's already happening.
Yeah.
So how do you, technology like trade is a disruptor. And, Schumpeter's creative destruction, it all sounds very good in your economics textbook until you're the one that gets destroyed. And then you find this is a terrible thing. We haven't really begun to see the sort of anti-technology backlash that you've seen against trade, because then you'd be, by definition, a Luddite. And nobody wants to be called a Luddite. Nobody wanted to be called a protectionist not very long ago, but now people are reveling in it, so who knows? So I think this is one of those issues where you're going to need to have some kind of global guidelines. And this is an area, although there is great tension between the US and China, I think this and climate change are two issues on which these countries must work together. They're both too important in those two fields for them not to work together, and they have to have common objectives because the risks are high for both of them. So without them, we're not going to get a deal that will be global in nature. And if you try to handle this in a piecemeal way, I don't think it's going to work. So the answer to your question is, I really don't know. I'm not sure anyone knows. But I think we have to be vigilant that whatever path we follow is one that is carefully thought out and where there is a degree of global consensus on what that path should be. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it actually leads to my second question.
Okay.
I have to say that on that note, it will probably be the last question, but if anyone really wants to ask the final one after this, that's okay too. But that's go ahead,
So allow me just maybe the last question. Since you mentioned about for China and US, they may come up with a common objective and to work on together. So in your opinion, how might the WTA or sort of organization, they kind of facilitate this discussion around emerging technologies to ensure they can contribute positively to this global trade?
I think the WTO can and should have a role to play. I also think the WTO can and should have a role to play in terms of allocating or coming up with a system of carbon pricing. We have 70 different prices for carbon around the world. In Kazakhstan, it's $1 per metric ton. On the European exchange, it fluctuates. I don't know what it is. It was close to 100 euros a ton before. Something like that, yeah. So, I mean, that's a huge disparity. And because you could say this could be a subsidy, and WTO has these agreements on subsidies, because fossil fuels, the IMF just said that fossil fuels for subsidies come to 7.2% of GDP, global GDP, more than governments spend on education and 3/4 what they spend on health. Now, a lot of that has been to make sure that people could stay warm during the winter with the energy crisis that we've had. But there is a role for the WTO to play I think, in these emerging technologies and in the whole question of climate change. Because the infrastructure is there. To try and create another organization to handle this right now, you've got UNEP, you've got OECD, you've got the bank, and you've got the IMF. Amongst these existing organizations, there should be a division of labor that leads to a solution. It's the members are the same. The outcome, people should have similar objectives and a similar desire to try and achieve these objectives. So I think there is a role. The WTO, as I say, I mean, things have been rough, but maybe not as rough as everyone thinks. They have produced some successes that have been notable, and including on fishery subsidies. So I don't know that there's a better solution than that.
Thank you.
Wei Huan.
I asked the last question because I think Keith is the best person to answer this question. This is the question goes to the very fundamental decision making as we talk about the rulemaking stuff. So,
Yep.
Based on your decades of experience at the WTO, do you think that there is a willingness among the membership to change fundamentally the consensus-based decision making, or to divide from it?
Excellent question.
To a certain extent, they've already decided this. In Buenos Aires, they launched these so-called joint, boy, this is a bad name, I have to say, joint statement initiatives.
Oh, yeah.
Who wants to learn more about that? Why don't we call them something, I wanted to call them the Buenos Aires issues, or I don't know, the tango issues, or something that's had a little snap to it. What they are is plurilaterals, and they've delivered results. And not everyone likes this. The Indians and the South Africans hate this. But you've got now, virtually every member, with the exception of those two, belongs to one of these things or the other. And they've achieved some quite notable outcomes. The domestic regulation in services has a provision in there that prohibits discrimination against women. Now, that's a labor standard. It's more than that, of course, but that's what it says. You cannot discriminate against women in the workplace. No new regulation that you come up with in services can discriminate against women. That's astonishing and quite a remarkable thing. And that came about with a consensus of I think it's 65 members who signed up to that agreement. Things can be done. We're looking at environment through a very different prism. And China is leading on plastics. China was leading on the question of investment. That's the way things are going. And there's the Indians and the South Africans bring legal arguments against it, but you know what? I'm not a lawyer, but this isn't a legal thing. This is a political thing. And you bring a panel back and the panel rules against this, no one's going to pay attention. They're going to keep going ahead. And so that's the way forward. Getting a consensus on some of these issues is just too hard. Whether you can do this kind of approach with something like agriculture, which is desperately in need of reform, I think that's going to be tricky. And but I don't see consensus going by the boards, because if you decide that consensus is not the way to do things, and you have an agreement that is put in place by a vote, and some country that voted against this is found to not be compliant and would be taken to dispute settlement and would lose a case about an agreement they never accepted, that's not sustainable. So I don't see how that happens. I think you just have to go forward with those who are in favor, extending these things on a non-discriminatory basis to all members, MFN. That's the way to do it, because any other approach, I think, is going to be too tricky.
The risk of extending the conversation any further, I just want to say that Hosuk says that the era of most favored nation is ending. It's over. But I don't want to keep extending this conversation, because this is how conversations with Keith always go. They just keep going on.
Sorry.
And so we have to call an end to this, unfortunately, for everyone. And I just wanted to say thank you very much to everyone who showed up here as well as to the online viewers who are tuning in. I think we've got a QR code that's being flashed up on the screen now if you want to subscribe to the Hinrich Foundation Thought Leadership newsletter, in which Keith appears very regularly. Please do, we'd be very honored. Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up, and thank you for all these great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chuan Wei. Thanks, mate. Good job. Well done.